Hello and welcome to our Masterclass, Reversing Compassion Fatigue and Burnout for Healthcare Professionals. I'm Marty Wallner, and in our time we're spending together today, I'm going to share some information with you and also provide some ways, some simple ways for you to feel better and get reconnected and love your job again as we try to meet the needs of healthcare professionals that are struggling with compassion fatigue and burnout. You saw some candles burning there, and that's what we're going to use the analogy today to think about you as a healthcare professional, a candle burning. And what does that look like for you in terms of your energy level, your inspiration, your passion, your motivation, and your celebration for who you are and the magical connection you have in the healthcare industry and the healthcare field? So if we think about your candle burning and then struggling with the stress of compassion fatigue or slipping in to a difficult position of burnout, you can take a look at maybe your candles flickering a bit or perhaps even dimming somewhat. As we take a look at this, hopefully we're able to raise self-awareness, have you connect with some of the components of compassion fatigue and burnout, and then empower you as to how to meet your needs and try to make it a different situation and help yourself feel better. So when we talk about energy and thinking about that flame burning for you, we're thinking about and talking about the long hours that you work, understanding about the responsibilities and the tasks that you have, and you've got a lot on your plate, especially in the healthcare industry, and that can sap our energy. And perhaps you don't have the energy you normally have in terms of your connection and moving forward. How do you actually get up and get moving to find that energy? It causes you perhaps physical and emotional exhaustion, depleting your resources, which is causing you that low energy. And maybe you're finding a difference in how you're connecting with the rest of the world around you and your personal well-being. It's affecting both your mind and your body in terms of having that low energy because of the compassion fatigue. And then your inspiration, really considering your why. You originally got into the healthcare profession and perhaps specializing in a kind of medicine or supporting a different community. But when we struggle with that compassion fatigue and burnout, it really obscures our deeper purpose. And I'll have you think about in terms of trying to reignite your inspiration to think about your why. What originally drove you into the medical field or into your special part of that? And in terms of trying to rekindle, reignite that inspiration, it can be helpful to go back and really consider the why. And then the passion in terms of that fire burning, literally the candle burning. And you find if you're struggling with compassion fatigue and burnout, that you may feel diminished enthusiasm, that commitment to making a difference has changed. It's just difficult to get focused and look forward to the future and try to connect with different systems and different things that may be actually causing you stress. Your job satisfaction goes down. So just your connection to the people in your job, your patients, any of the systemic issues and stresses that you may be dealing with is actually causing that weight on your shoulders, and that compassion fatigue is impacting your job satisfaction. And then it impacts the quality of patient care because patients are going to be able to pick up on the fact if you're not presenting and your best self and offering peak performance in terms of effectiveness and connection and attunement, the patients are going to notice. And perhaps having that passion, your passion being impacted is also then impacting the quality of the care that you're giving to your patients. And then your motivation, that inner fire that's burning, that intrinsic motivation, compassion fatigue and burnout erodes that in terms of how do you stay focused? How do you be connected? How do you keep hope? A lot of times we fall into that pit of burnout and we become hopeless and helpless. And that zaps our motivation as well. And it starts to feel like that weight of stress, what we're carrying around, is insurmountable. We're never going to be able to figure out how to deal with the stress at work or personally, or how to change things up for ourselves in terms of if we're on our way to burnout. And it's a lack of drive. It's that inner push. Each and every day we get up, we have long hours, lots of responsibilities. That compassion fatigue, the weight of that stress can actually impact your inner drive. And then finally, celebration. When we're so focused on the stress and dealing with the challenges of stress, it's tough to find the happiness and joy, and being able to honor and stand in those moments when we have made a difference, when we have been able to influence someone, or that connection, those positive ways of connecting with the patients and seeing the healing journey and the process that we support people, being able to stay in that space and being able to celebrate that. Unfortunately, when struggling with compassion fatigue and burnout, there's not a lot of time for celebration of achievements or milestones. We kind of get blinded to that and don't notice those types of things because we're so focused on the stress. And we tend not to celebrate ourselves. Not a lot of self-affirmation. Our self-talk gets impacted by the stress and the compassion fatigue, and sometimes even self-sabotage. We even do some things, even subconsciously at work or personally, that put us in a less healthy or less connected position. And without that celebration, we can't experience what we're going to talk about and unpack a little further, something called compassion satisfaction. Being able to shift our focus on not maybe some of the things that are stressing us out and some of the things that weigh us down, but focusing and shifting on some of the positive aspects, the people who we have helped and the way we have had a positive influence, and hopefully turn around your sense of unfulfillment, reconnecting you at a whole different level. So that's your fire burning, that's your candle burning. And the idea today is to recognize it, be aware of it, and also find things to do and empower yourself to be able to get that flame to burn even brighter. So our goals for our time together in our masterclass is to identify and distinguish between compassion fatigue and burnout. We're about to go over some terms, and some of the terms are interchangeable, and it can be really helpful to kind of find those nuanced differences and try to figure out specifically for you some of the needs you may have. The stress is revealing some of your needs, so we're going to talk about that. Hopefully, we'll also recognize the signs and symptoms of secondary and vicarious trauma. A lot of times in the healthcare field, in the industry, for professionals, we want to work through the stress, and we don't really even notice or recognize how our mind and body is being impacted by the compassion fatigue, by the secondary stress or vicarious trauma. So we're going to talk about that. Hopefully identify and discover risk and protective factors for compassion fatigue and burnout. So when we get into the risk factors, we're going to identify that there are certain risk factors we can control and certain risk factors that we can't control. But it's important really to understand what's putting us at risk for this secondary stress and that weight of our stress and compassion fatigue, and which of those risk factors can we influence? What can we control and can't control? And then we get into protective factors. So really leaning into the fact that there is a certain level of stress in the healthcare profession, and that compassion fatigue and burnout is a potential challenge for many healthcare professionals, and being able to come up with ways to protect, to build up our resilience, to be able to prevent that from happening. So we can certainly offer some different ways for you to deal with it if you're struggling with it and some of the symptoms have manifested themselves, but also how to build up your resilience and your strength to be able to deal with stress down the line as well. And then finally, offer some simple tools and strategies, simple, but not necessarily easy to integrate. So we're not going to be talking about a lot of complicated stuff, but it's really a change of thinking habits and behavioral habits and emotional response. So there's simple strategies and tools to be able to deal with the needs of your secondary trauma. And really, we're going to take a look at this through the trauma lenses to figure out how can we meet the needs of your mind and body and help you heal in simple ways, useful ways, things that are accessible for you to be able to integrate into your daily, both personal and professional lives. So I want you to take out something to write with and hopefully to write on if you have something in your space there. And we're going to do a bit of a brainstorm. We're going to make this very specific and personalized for you. And I'll have you think about and jot down a couple of responses as to what happens to you specifically when you feel compassion fatigue and or burnout. Now, there are no right or wrong answers, so this is a creative exercise to try to generate some different thinking. And when you think about in terms of physically and mentally and emotionally, behaviorally, maybe you're doing things different, what actually goes on? How is it showing up for you when you feel compassion fatigue and or burnout? I work closely with Dr. Sandra Bloom, who is a former professor at Drexel University, and she's done extensive trauma research on secondary trauma and vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and burnout. And she's come up with a long list of different results for healthcare professionals that are struggling with compassion fatigue, and how that manifests itself can come out physically, can come out mentally, behaviorally, emotionally, and it may have connected with some of the ways that it's actually manifesting and coming out for you as well. But as you take a look at this, there are some surprising things on there, like incompetence and actual communication breakdown, where people aren't actually communicating with each other, or there's this underlying anger, or aggressiveness, or passive aggressiveness. It changes people's identity and how they're connecting with the people around them. It can actually then perhaps we take things home with us, and it can start to cause things like nightmares and triggers and flashbacks, and we feel less safe in the world and how we connect with it. So there's lots of different ways. It's very personalized how anyone, any caregiver, anyone who gives to others, but especially healthcare professionals, what that may look like and what the results may look like for compassion fatigue and burnout. So let's define some terms. Like I mentioned earlier, it could be helpful to really try to develop a lexicon of terms that we use. Now, a lot of times you'll see these terms used somewhat interchangeably, and it all really talks about the impact for people and what needs it reveals for you as a healthcare professional, and then move on to what you can actually do about it. Now, hopefully you've downloaded the workbook that came with today's masterclass. I'm going to ask Paula, who's helping us out, and admin, to put the link for the workbook in the chat window. So hopefully you'll have that. But you'll find in the workbook, if you have access to that, you will find that on the second page, it goes into the definition of terms. And then it has a lot of worksheets, and we're going to talk about journal prompts and a lot of activities for you to do to kind of make this come alive for you. But as we talk about these terms, you can follow along if you've actually had a chance to download the workbook. We're looking through the trauma lens when we talk about compassion fatigue and burnout. Compassion fatigue is secondary trauma. And so when we think about, and when you think about and consider secondary trauma, it's for support people, for healthcare professionals like yourself, or anyone who supports any type of caretaker who actually supports people who may be impacted by trauma. It's not our primary situation, but as healthcare professionals, we're supporting someone who's sick or injured, or a family, or someone else who may be going through some stress or trauma. And some of that stress comes our way. It's a lot like secondary smoke dangers. And if you may not be a smoker, but you're in the same proximity as a smoker, that secondary smoke can actually impact your mind and body. Well, similar for trauma. So it doesn't actually have to be our situation that's traumatizing, but the fact that a healthcare professional helps people who are going through trauma sends some of that trauma our way. And here's the thing, the way it shows up, and they're doing a lot of new research on secondary trauma and the impact of secondary trauma. But a lot of times it shows up in the same way and with the same manifestation and symptoms as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So STSD, secondary trauma stress disorder, is a thing. Things like nightmares and disrupted sleep, lack of appetite, triggers and flashbacks, avoidance of certain areas. A lot of the different symptoms of PTSD can also be a symptom of secondary trauma, or STSD, which for a lot of healthcare professionals and other caregivers, they do struggle with that. So just understanding and being aware of the secondary trauma can be very helpful in terms of understanding, how it's impacting both your mind and your body. But it's coming at it a secondary way. And a lot of times, especially for healthcare professionals, you may think you need to work through that stress. We can soldier through. The problem is it's leaving imprints, memory imprints, and core belief system. There's all sorts of emotional reactions. We have to really kind of that self-awareness and locking in to how secondary trauma may be impacting you, and then what do you need and how can you actually meet those needs. When we talk about vicarious trauma, so secondary trauma is the larger set, and then vicarious trauma is a subset of that. So vicarious trauma is also secondary trauma, but in a little bit of a deeper way, for a healthcare professional or another caretaker to be able to support someone who may be going through a similar situation or traveling a similar journey than you have, or a colleague of yours has. So, for instance, if you help cancer patients and you've had a journey of dealing with cancer yourself, a lot of their journey and the stories and the situations they and their family go through may connect you with you in a vicarious way. So there's all sorts of different types of trauma and different ways you may be supporting some of your patients and the other people around you. And if it's starting to connect with some of the journey that you've taken and you've walked a similar walk, that may be bringing up some memories, making you think about some things, even triggering you in some ways in a vicarious way that may reveal some different needs than other people who haven't had a similar journey. So a lot of different caretakers, a lot of different healthcare professionals can actually experience secondary trauma. Vicarious trauma, a little bit more specifically, is for those who have similar experiences, and that may mean they need a different set of tools to be able to meet their needs. And then we get into empathy fatigue and compassion fatigue. So obviously, we're talking about compassion fatigue as a general sense. When we talk about empathy fatigue specifically, when you think about maybe the nuanced difference, empathy is the feelings, compassion is the action. For those healthcare professionals, if you feel with other people, some people are naturally empathic. Others, maybe they need to work a little more. And after you've been in the business, perhaps it takes a little more energy and focus to be empathic with your patients. But the idea is when we feel with people, when we're able to take their perspective, when we understand at a deeper level their thoughts and their feelings and their beliefs, it can make us tired and exhausted. So just empathizing with people and for whatever reason, even both professionally and personally, a lot of people come to empaths. If you're a good listener and you can give empathy, maybe the people around you, both personally and professionally, start to depend on you for that. They look at you for that as a strength. Well, the challenge is for those empaths, they need someone like that as well. If we're holding space for people and we're feeling with people, but you don't necessarily have someone that's doing that for you, and when you're able to get that energy out, that's when empathy fatigue happens, when we start to get depleted and exhausted and feel that impact because of how much we're feeling and how much emotion we're putting out there. That's when we take stories home with us, perhaps. We're starting to dream about our patients. There's all sorts of ways that empathy fatigue can actually manifest itself, but that reveals a whole set of different needs. Now, that obviously can go hand in hand with compassion fatigue, where empathy is the feeling, compassion is the action, just showing up, the long hours, the long shifts, the answering of emails, the answering of texts, taking your laptop with you away on vacation or weekends, all that showing up and doing for others is causing compassion fatigue. So empathy fatigue and compassion fatigue can go together. Certainly could have them separately as well, but the combination can really cause the exhaustion. That's where the fatigue comes in. But if you're feeling with people and have the empathy fatigue, you're showing up with people, working long hours and still working outside of work time, you're still attending to your patients and perhaps supporting staff, that's when compassion fatigue starts to set in. And that's the secondary or vicarious trauma in terms of now revealing needs as a healthcare professional and what can you do for yourself to try to reverse that. And then we get to burnout. And if you're following along in the workbook, you'll see that it is a bit of an escalating impact. And burnout is when it all comes together in terms of physical, emotional, mental exhaustion. This is when you're in the shower in the morning and you're wondering how you're going to get to work that day. And oh my gosh, I have another 12-hour shift today. And maybe you don't have time for your personal relationships because you're so spent after doing, your work responsibilities that you get to burnout. Burnout is an interesting place for different people. It's very individualized. For some, they need to make a change. They get so deep down into that hole that looking up and trying to figure out how to dig out, it may be better for them to make a change in employment, change in relationships, change in location, moving. There's all sorts of different things that some healthcare professionals need to do for themselves to actually get them out of that dark hole of burnout. For others, you can actually reverse it. And you can actually avoid burnout. And if you start to feel yourself getting to that point, and we're going to talk about some of the other manifestations and symptoms of that, if you start to feel some of your physical exhaustion, mental exhaustion, it's all coming together in terms of trying to figure out if you're ready to switch jobs or you have to go in and ask for a different position in your workspace, a change needs to be made. Well, there are some things you can do to actually meet the needs before you get to that point. And we're going to talk about how to try to avoid that, but recognizing that for some healthcare professionals, more significant changes may need to be made rather than just trying to do something to fall in love with your job. So those are some terms in terms of trying to communicate the right terminology and the nuanced differences in some of that language. So we talk now and get into risk factors. We're going to break this down into two categories, personal and professional risk factors. And when you think about these as we go through these, I mentioned this earlier, consider which of these you may be able to have some level of control and influence, and which maybe you can't control. And as we get into trying to build up resilience and really becoming stronger to be able to reverse your compassion fatigue and burnout, it's all about the inside game. It's all about working on ourselves to become stronger and build resilience. A lot going on in the outside world. A lot of stressors, a lot of trauma, a lot specifically in our agencies, hospitals, medical centers, a lot going on in terms of stressors externally. It's about the internal things we can control and we can work on to build our resilience to be able to meet the needs and meet the moments that are stressful and maybe causing us the compassion fatigue. So we're going to go through personal and professional. Consider which of these you can have some level of control and influence and which maybe not so much. So your personality and coping style. So like I mentioned, everybody's different. So this is very individualized, and each of us have different personality traits, maybe introverts, extroverts. You can have you consider things and process emotions differently. Some people process inwardly, some people process outwardly. You can be more verbal, you can be more pensive. There's all sorts of different ways and different things that come into each of our personalities. I mean, they have large surveys and different scales of how to figure out your personality and find you on this personality scale. And as it turns out, those personality traits actually impact the level of compassion fatigue and burnout that you're feeling and your ability to be able to reverse that and avoid your burnout. So different personalities can be different, it can have different resilience. Just understanding that and really being self-aware, leaning into the fact that maybe your personality trait is exacerbating your burnout, your compassion fatigue, your stress. If you're just a really high-strung person and that's your personality type, that may be something you need to address, and there may be some other needs there that you can try to meet those needs outside of work and outside of this conversation. And then coping style, your coping strategies. What do you do to actually cope? There's lots of different ways to cope, to get through stress, some healthy, some not so much. The idea is that depending upon what coping strategies, tools you have, and the coping style that you use those tools, you administer those tools, is going to determine the level of your compassion fatigue and your ability to avoid burnout. So if you can add more coping strategies, if we can empower you with more healthy ways to deal with stress, that can certainly build up resilience on a personal level to be able to meet those moments of stress that actually weighing you down and combining for your compassion fatigue. Then your personal history and trauma. So most of our brain, 2/3 of our brain is formed by our experiences. So individually, each of us is different. We all have a lot stored in especially in our subconscious, the implicit parts of our brain, from the moment we were born until now. And all of those experiences are setting a blueprint for stress and how we handle stress and react to stress. For different people who have different experiences, and their brains may actually be wired differently because of those experiences, depending upon their personal history and their trauma, that's going to impact how they're handling the current stress and how they're able to reverse their compassion fatigue or avoid burnout. So our previous trauma, our previous experiences actually impact what's happening to us now in the present time and also in the future. Sometimes if we can be aware of that and we start to understand at a better level and maybe reveal some things that may have happened to us previously that have left a traumatic or stressful imprint on our brains, we can do some things to try to heal those areas, even childhood trauma, to be able to deal with current stress and future stress in a different way. Your personal history and trauma actually impacts and is connected to your ability to handle the stress that you're dealing with as being a healthcare professional. Current life circumstances. So a lot of stressors in the world. So it's, a lot happening right in your workplace in terms of stress, but maybe you have stress at home, stress in your community. There's stress in the world. There's all sorts of levels of different stress. And what's happening in life is we're bombarded 24/7 with all sorts of different levels of stress. What's happening for you currently is connected to how you're dealing with the stress at work and compassion fatigue or burnout. Sometimes a healthcare professional can deal with their personal stuff and deal with some of that, and a lot of the work stuff starts to change as well. Not only is your previous history and perhaps trauma impacting what's happening today, but everything else that's going on for you in the world is also impacting your compassion fatigue and burnout as well. relationships. So we heal through relationships and social support, and building community can certainly be a great way to be able to bring people together and talk about what they're going through. Unfortunately, compassion fatigue and burnout aren't top topic of conversation for healthcare professionals. There's not a lot of doctors and nurses and technicians and other medical professionals that are getting around. Not a lot. I'm trying to dig it up and trying to encourage that and talk about it and try to support each other. There may be some judgment, there may be some suggestion, but just to hold space and create safe spaces for people to actually connect and be able to share their stories, and then trade different ways and different strategies that perhaps other healthcare professionals can share to be able to deal with their stress. The problem is people talk over each other and at each other rather than with each other and coming together collectively, and that can actually exacerbate the stress. And especially if you get into negative type thinking, if you start to try to build support with your colleagues or other communities, and you get a lot of complaining, a lot of victim mindset, emotions are contagious. We want to surround ourselves with people who can lift us up, who can accept us, how we can show up as our authentic selves and can hold safe space for us to connect in an accepting way. We're going to talk more about that and the importance of relationships and social support. Spiritual resources are a personal risk factor, way to perhaps influence risk factors. Now, this can range anywhere from perhaps religious practices to different types of spiritual things like meditation and mindfulness. There's all sorts of spiritual influences that can actually regulate the mind and body. And if we're able to get in a more regulated place, mind and body, we're able to then deal with stress and meet the needs in stressful situations and stressful moments in a whole different way. So if we can get more spiritual resources, get more mental regulation, less overthinking perhaps with some different spiritual resources, and bring that into the conversation, we can impact some of the risk factors personally. And then finally, your personal attitude and connection through your work style. If you're a workaholic whose top priority and you want to have your finger on the pulse of everything that's going on in your system, and you're constantly putting in over hours and working outside the expectations, that's going to perhaps put you in a different position in terms of struggling with compassion fatigue and burnout. Your work style, how you look at work in terms of turning your phone off. Some people have two phones. They're being texted, emails, laptop. There's all sorts of devices that we can stay connected to the work and the stress of the work. And different people have different work styles. Some people have FOMO, fear of missing out. They feel if they literally take 2 straight days off with disconnecting from work, that they're missing something and they need to stay connected. And we're going to talk about how we can make some small adjustments, even in work style, because that's something that perhaps you can control to be able to reduce your compassion fatigue and burnout. And then we move on to some of the professional risk factors. Your work environment. Again, emotions are contagious, stress is contagious. So literally the chair you're sitting in, the lighting, whether you can see out a window, anything else that may be in your workspace, subconsciously, implicitly is impacting your stress, is impacting your mind and body. So what can you do to actually lower the stress factor in your work environment? That also may be taking breaks, being able to, what we do call brain breaks, or habit stacking different things together with stressful tasks. We're going to talk about that more in a moment as well. But what can you do in your work environment to make some small adjustments, some small changes to be able to reduce your stress? Just acknowledging administrative support. This may be an area where you don't have a lot of control, but certainly that can add to the stress and certainly contribute to any compassion fatigue or burnout if you're not getting the support that you think you need or deserve, or perhaps there's been layoffs, there's been shifts in departments, there's been all sorts of things that have gone on behind the scenes that are actually contributing to your stress. The staff and coworkers you have around you. I mentioned several times that emotions are contagious. And so if the people around you are complaining, they're blaming, they're shaming, they're in a victim mindset, that's going to contribute to your emotional temperature as well. You may have how much control you have in terms of who you're working with, the teams you work with, whatever way you can influence, boundary or set limits on any type of negative thinking and getting parked in the problem rather than moving on to the solutions, or coming together to support one another to build resilience rather than trying to rail against the system and shame and blame and complain and be victims. Find ways to focus that energy in a more positive, more constructive way. Financial pressures. Certainly in the healthcare profession, there's a lot of things where there's budget cuts, there's layoffs, a lot of things go on financially within the industry itself that actually add to your compassion, fatigue, and burnout. And then finally, your interactions with your patients. Everyone's a lot more stressed. We got a lot going on out in the world. Certainly when they're in a vulnerable situation by being sick or injured or dealing with some other health adversity or challenge, that can bring up their stress response. Patients are getting more disrespectful, they're getting less compliant, and perhaps you become more jaded in terms of the response you're getting from patients. But really to look at that in a different way with more wisdom and insight and realize that whatever they're going through, medical situation they're going through, health situation they're going through, if their stress response has been activated, that's going to bring out all sorts of challenging behaviors and emotional reactions. And being able to see that in a different way may make your response to their challenging response a bit different. So now it's time to put it all in reverse. We're going to now hopefully set the foundation for how to reverse your compassion, fatigue, and burnout. And as we've been talking about different ways to empower you, it starts out with self-awareness and understanding and really accepting that this type of stress is going to be part of your job and it starts to pile on, and certainly understanding the potential for compassion, fatigue, and burnout. But there's a correlation. It's not necessarily causation. So even though there's a direct connection and correlation for healthcare professionals in different areas of the healthcare field, doesn't mean it automatically causes it. And now with this new awareness and this new understanding and acceptance that it may be part of your job, if you can build resilience, if you can look at it and come up with a different stress mindset and look at your stress differently and have tools and ways to release that energy and release that stress, that can help and be the first step, that self-awareness to being able to reverse your compassion fatigue and avoid burnout. And then learning ways to manage it effectively. We can talk about it a lot. We want to share our stories, but it's all about making changes, simple, not necessarily easy changes, because they're habit and behavior pattern, mental mindset, ways to think about things. They can be changes that we make, but they can be managed effectively. And it's small. There's small doses of change throughout the day. So it's all about tweaks and polishes and being able to habit stack healthy things to do, ways to release stress with stressful tasks and stressful moments. And that's the way we identify strategies that be able to avoid burnout, is to be able to really be able to go through our day and be able to build a journal of the stressful situations, the stressful moments, maybe the stressful people, the patients that we deal with, and then be able to build strategies to habit stack healthy things to be able to do, to be able to release that stress. And then recognizing the power of supporting relationships and what a healthy relationship looks like. And when you're sharing your story and trying to express that emotion, what you can hope for in terms of people holding space for you and accepting what you're sharing, which will then enable you to show up in an authentic way. So we're going to do another brainstorm. So hopefully you have something to write on and write with in your space there. And we're talking about needs now, specifically for you, to make this real and make this useful for you. What do you need, you specifically, to reverse compassion fatigue and avoid burnout? When you think about physically, emotionally, behaviorally, what do you need from your administration, from your staff, from your personal relationships, anything you may need? There are no right or wrong answers. Jot down 2 or 3 things that you think you need to reverse your compassion fatigue and avoid burnout. So it's all about meeting the needs, and you may have jotted down a couple of things. And I will predict that some of you, some healthcare professionals, may have put vacation and days off on there, which are all great. And certainly vacation and days off, any type of larger self-care strategies like that can be very effective in terms of rejuvenating and re-energizing, refreshing ourselves to get back to work. The problem is, or the challenge is, that escapism doesn't cure compassion fatigue or burnout. Even though it may be good for mind and body, it may be good to kind of reset ourselves and get refreshed and reignited. If we come back to stress, and if we come back to the workplace and it's stress just as we left it, that's not going to be very helpful for us. You need to make workplace and personal changes. The combination of the two would be the ideal. If we could actually maximize getting away, going on vacation and unplugging, taking days off, and really, refreshing, rejuvenating, and then coming back and the stress is less, and we've been able to build up a workspace or work towards a workspace that is less stressful, more connected, more accepting, a safer space. That's the combination we're looking for in terms of reversing compassion fatigue and burnout. But escapism on its own is not going to cure that. It's a good thing for mind and body, but in terms of the overall picture of making changes, you're going to have to make some changes in your workspace or personally as well. How do you think about your work? What's your why? Why do you do this? In terms of why you originally got into it, why you're doing this now, your effectiveness, the role you play in the situation, in the system. How do you measure success? What does a successful day look like for you, a week, a month? In terms of, getting on that grind, being on that hamster wheel, we want to know what success looks like and then also celebrate that. We want to be able to hold space and be in that and honor some of the progress, if we're able to meet the needs, help someone heal, support a family, anything that may have happened positively and was successful for that day, for that week, for that month. We want to be able to measure that and celebrate that. As mentioned before, really deciding what can you control and not control at work. A lot of times, healthcare professionals want to talk a lot about what they can control. The system, administration, work requirements, conditions. There's all sorts of things maybe you can control that we spend a lot of energy focused on. We want to identify that pain. We certainly want to name it and claim that, but we need to move on to talk about what we can control. And some of that may be within us. Some of that may not be the external and maybe the internal, as we're talking about resilience being an inside game. And what are the costs and rewards for you in terms of making changes? There may be some sacrifices for you if you're making some changes, and you may have to set some limits. It becomes a bit of a dance, and you're changing the dance in terms of your natural routines and your daily habits. And there may be some costs up front, but what are the rewards down the line? Can you give up some short-term goals, and maybe there's some short-term cost or investment in your time, your energy, or refocus, or a different mindset? But what is that going to look like down the line? What's the ultimate reward that you may be able to achieve if you're able to change things up and be able to advocate for yourself and be able to attune to your own needs and then meet your needs? And how have you personally changed, or you may be currently personally changing? That can include, direct things, obvious things like professional development. You've been in the business so many years, you have new wisdom, new insight. Perhaps you've become jaded. Perhaps because you've been in the business, and certainly after the pandemic and all the stress through that period of time and just some of the natural things you deal with, that, your mindset, your attitude, your perspective of things have changed. Really leaning into that. And that self-awareness in terms of how you connect with the job, with work, and the people around you, the patients, your colleagues, staff, administration, and how has that changed you at all? Now we're going to get into the simple steps to take. And I mentioned that these are simple steps, not necessarily easy. These are not complicated things. Some of them may even seem obvious to you, but these are actually antidotes to compassion fatigue and burnout. There's a lot more. I'm offering you 5. That's even a lot for our short time together today. So I'm going to invite you, just as I go through these, pick 1 or 2. Just really stay focused on 1 or 2 of these areas on where you can make a difference and you can actually do something for yourself in terms of making changes, either personally or professionally. We're going to build an action plan in a couple of moments. And our action plan is going to be in 1 or 2 of these 5 areas. So this is going to be a lot in terms of all the areas. Pick 1 or 2 as we move forward. I mentioned this before, and really have you focus on something, not sure if you heard of this before or not, but something called compassion satisfaction. So this comes from a book called Compassionomics, and there's been a lot of research about the human brain and what we focus on. And when we get stressed, we go into a part of our brain, the stressful part of our brain, that starts to focus on a lot of negative things, a lot of negative thinking. Our thinking actually becomes distorted, and we put this negative spin on things that tends to magnify and catastrophize some of the challenging things, some of the stressful things in our lives. We can actually take control of that stressful thinking. We can actually do some things and change some of the self-talk, perhaps, but also the focus, shift our focus onto the positive impact that we're making. The people who we have helped, who we've supported and seen that transformation, that journey of healing or growth, or for those self-awareness, self-acceptance, if we've seen families come together and support each other in ways that maybe we didn't expect. We can actually focus and shift our focus, shift our mind and what we're stressing and focusing on to the satisfaction piece of it, to the positive aspects of what's happening, and they may be a lot less than the negative things. I mean, it may be overwhelming, the stress you're dealing with, but really finding one or two things daily, weekly, or monthly to show positive regard and celebrate some compassion, satisfaction, and honor that connection, honor the healing, and be in that space of celebration. Work-life balance. So yeah, this is thrown around a lot, right? So you're probably not the first time you heard about work-life balance, but that's what gets out of whack. And for those healthcare professionals that are trying to reverse compassion fatigue and avoid burnout, you can start with the balance between your work obligations and your personal obligations. And sometimes it's not a lot that needs to be done, but there is an imbalance there. And that is what's exacerbating the stress. Maybe you need to go out and play a little more pickleball, or you need to go cook some more, bake some cookies, or there's something else in your life that is enjoyable for you, or you can connect with other people around you, or just if you do it for half an hour, just a little more time on a weekly basis, that will shift the work-life balance. But a lot of research indicates that for those healthcare professionals that struggle with compassion fatigue and burnout, it's because the work-life balance is out of whack. And what happens is the stress gets to be so heavy, and the weight that we're carrying around is that we can't really show a lot of joy. We can't really enjoy activities. We're so preoccupied with the stress that we can't seem to get out of that. By shifting the balance, that may help us and empower us for that. Self-compassion and self-care. We're going to pause on this one for a little bit. There's a trauma researcher named Dr. Gabor Mate who shares that there is no compassion fatigue. He says that compassion fatigue is really a lack of self-compassion fatigue. And the reason why any giver, but especially healthcare professionals, experience compassion fatigue is because they don't have enough self-compassion. They're not setting enough limits on their time, on their energy. Their self-talk is defeating, sometimes self-sabotaging. It can be negative thinking, worrying, anger, anxiety, and all the manifestations of negative thinking. And all that's going on, that lack of self-compassion, is causing the compassion fatigue. As human beings, we're givers. We're wired to give to others, to support others. As a healthcare professional, you got into this business to give to others and to help others and support others. That's a natural tendency. And if our needs are being met, then we don't get fatigue given to others. We start to get fatigue given to others, according to the research, because we neglect our own needs and our own self-compassion and our own self-care. So boost your self-compassion, boost your self-care, and you'll see your compassion fatigue disappear. So self-compassion, boundary setting, find enjoyable activities, self-talk, the voice inside your head. Talk to yourselves and have the compassion in your own mind and your own self-talk that you have for others. Talk to yourself like you would a good friend or a family member. If your compassion plan does not include yourself, it's incomplete. So if you're giving and giving and giving to others without focused on your own needs, which would also include self-care, then it's going to be very tough to show up with your best self. Now, in your workbook, going back to the workbook, there is some help there for self-care. There's a self-care wheel and some different suggestions for self-care. When you think about self-care, don't only think about the large strategies, think about micro doses of self-care throughout your day. And this is where the habit stacking comes in. If you're familiar with the book Atomic Habits, James Clear talks about habit stacking and being able to intentionally and purposefully put together habits and stack together healthy habits. And you can change your patterns. And what happens is we become very habitual as the mind, it gets dependent upon patterns and habits, and you can actually be intentional about stacking those together. And the way you can actually do that and show those micro doses of self-care is to be able to journal, be able to track throughout your day your stressful moments, stressful tasks, stressful interactions with people, your patients, your colleagues, and stack something healthy to that. You take a walk for a minute or two. You drink some cold water, splash some cold water into your face, maybe hum or snap. There may be something you can do just for a minute or two as a habitual something to be able to habit stack with a stressful task. So there's more in the workbook about self-compassion, self-care, and we can talk more about that down the line as well. Then we get into a stress oasis and really achieving the flow state of your brain. So you can actually be intentional with mind control to be able to take yourself into a part of your brain where you can block everything out, block all of your stresses out. And we talk about creating stress oasis, activities and hobbies that you can get involved in that actually are so immersible. So you get so involved in the activity that everything else is blocked out in the rest of the world. And that activity needs to be just challenging enough that it holds your attention. It's not something that you can do easily where it becomes boring and your mind starts to wander. It's not something that's too challenging that will cause you frustration and perhaps you'll end up not doing it anymore, but just challenging enough, just enough of a challenge to keep you occupied, keep you focused, and take you into what's called the flow state of your brain. Theta waves start to be activated, which get very compartmentalized and get you very focused on what you're doing. And we call this a stress oasis. And there's all sorts of ways to achieve flow state. Athletes can achieve flow state, artists, someone who paints, someone who creates music, artists, dancers can get into flow state. You can actually curl up with a book. There are some readers, doesn't work necessarily for me because my mind wanders while reading, but for some, they can curl up with a book and all of a sudden it's 3 hours later. They don't know where the time went and they were so immersed in that story, they were in the flow state of the brain. So what can you do to create some activities in your life to achieve flow state, to really activate those theta waves of your brain and be able to block everything off and even perhaps create a stress oasis? Now, this may not be necessarily on the job stuff. Certainly, if you can get into flow state for small periods of time throughout your day with your work or anything else you're dealing with, that can be helpful. But this can also be outside of work in your personal time to create those moments or create those activities or hobbies that actually provide, that get you in the flow state, but provide that stress oasis. So for instance, I am a sports official, high school sports official for both soccer and basketball. And I do varsity sports. And when I'm on the basketball court or I'm on the soccer field, for those 2 hours, the challenge is enough for me to be able to handle everything, run up and down physically, stay with the athletes, that I can enter the flow state. Everything else is blocked out. For that 2 hours I'm on the basketball court, for that 2 hours I'm on the soccer field, I'm not thinking about anything else stressful in my life. I'm focused on that activity. And that then is my stress oasis. I'm able to enter the flow state, activate the theta waves, even though I deal with some stress in that environment, parents and coaches, in terms of the youth sports environment. But understanding that I have some tools to deal with that, but I can block everything out. And that becomes my stress oasis as I achieve flow state. I have a friend who's a nurse, and she went through some personal issues. She had a romantic breakup where she had to move out and move back in with her parents for a short period of time. A lot of stress, went through a lot of sadness and questioning her future and things like that. And she found that by donating her time at a pet shelter, working with dogs, she was able to get into the flow state. She was able to enter that space, work with those animals, connect with them in such a way that was able to block out the rest of her stressful world. And that became her stress oasis. And by having a stress oasis, she was able to build up resilience. She was able to think of things differently. When she left there, her mind was refreshed. She was able to have a different perspective and how to deal with her stress and how to move on and how to have hope for the future because she was able to get into a place and achieve that flow state. One more, I have a doctor friend who's in a band and he plays drums. And he says, boy, when he's up there on stage and those little dives that he plays in, he gets into the flow state. He's able to actually get so lost and so immersed in his 1970s rock and roll that he blocks out the rest of his stresses in life. Find a stress oasis. Find ways to mentally take yourself in your mind to a place where you can achieve flow state and block out the other stresses of your life. And then finally, build social support and community. We're back to relationships and being able to find and figure out what relationships can actually help you, get out and reverse compassion fatigue and avoid burnout. When we talk about relationships, we really want to focus on healthy relationships. We all have a lot of people around us at work and perhaps personally. But what is a relationship that we can count on to help us reduce our stress? We want to try to avoid relationships that exacerbate the stress. Well, what do you mean? Why did you just go in and say that? Why did you let your colleague do that? Why don't you just go talk to your boss? Those are the types of responses from relationships around us that are going to escalate the emotion. That's not going to help us de-escalate and get us into a calmer space, both mind and body. So when we look for relationships, when we're building social support and community, we're looking for safe spaces. We're looking for spaces that will offer acceptance and allow us to show up with who we are and what struggles we're having without judgment and without suggestion. Building healthy relationships is our last topic for today. And I want to share with you the relationship circles. This comes from a former mentor of mine, the late Susanna Spanton, who talks about concentric circles and really understanding that inner circle of relationships. And those are the peeps that you can trust in terms of safety. They help you feel safe. You don't feel judged or put upon or additionally stressed by connecting with them. They're accepting. They can hold space and accept whatever mood you're in, whatever feelings you're sharing with them, and also then can connect with you in an authentic and genuine way. And hopefully you're also offering that for them as well, because it's that dance, it's that combination that can raise that power, that safety, and that ability to deal with stress. And only one person may be in your inner circle, one good friend, one good family member, one good colleague that is accepting and is a safe relationship can be very helpful in terms of trying to reverse your compassion fatigue and avoid burnout. But as you see, those circles get a little wider. And when you think about for yourselves, and you're more than welcome to write that down if you have something there, to start to put some names of people that you know in terms of what circle they may be in. And that may not be based on how long you've known them or whether you're related to them or not. I mean, I talk to my sister every week on the phone, but I'm not so sure she's in my inner circle. The things we talk about aren't necessarily going to be someone who I share with who are in my inner circle. We can put people both personally and professionally on different circles and feel different safety with them. And they may move, and maybe you're on a different circle for somebody else, and they are on in terms of for you, for your relationship circles. But this gives you an image, kind of something to look at in terms of deciding if you're building social support and community, who maybe you want to connect with, as if, again, if what we focus on is then what we can actually achieve in terms of outcomes. And if we're trying to reverse compassion fatigue and burnout, if you can surround yourself with people who will lift you up and who won't get necessarily parked in the problem, who will actually move on to building resilience and things we can do with what we can control, that could be very beneficial for you. So we end with an action plan. So like I mentioned, there were 5 different areas, probably 100 different areas. I could share some different tools and strategies with you. I've supported so many different healthcare professionals with reversing compassion fatigue and burnout. I invite you maybe to pick 1 or 2 of these areas where you can actually make a difference. You can actually make a change today. Do something different, habit stack, something with a stressful moment. Show more self-compassion or self-care. Shift your work-life balance. Achieve flow state. Understand compassion satisfaction. There's all sorts of things that you can consider when building your action plan. So I invite you to just to pick 1 or 2 things on that list and commit to it. Come up with different strategies. And maybe it's small steps at first. Maybe if you need to set boundary and limits, if you need to shift work-life balance, there's just some small ways you can start, but it's all about building momentum. The way that you can make this masterclass mean something for you is to take this information and turn it into action. And by starting out small, little things, little tweaks, little polishes, simple things that you can integrate into your day, different ways you can look at things, different mindset, different ways you can react to situations. By starting out small, you can then build that momentum. Being in the healthcare field, being a healthcare professional does not mean you're automatically going to struggle with compassion fatigue or burnout. It's not causation. There's a correlation, but not causation. And you can be empowered to do things for yourself and to take action, to be able to control your stressful thinking rather than your stressful thinking controlling you. Now, if you need more information, there are some free gifts. We're going to be giving you some stuff. Paul has put in some things in the chat window. You'll also be emailed some information as well. Hopefully, you've downloaded the workbook. Please connect with me online. You can find me on x.com, LinkedIn, or Medium at Marty Wallner. I strongly urge you to reach out